Hello my beautiful babies, this video is about a very silly idea. An idea I do not think you should worry about or take even remotely seriously. That being said, it's an idea that makes a lot of people quite anxious. It's an idea that a lot of people report wishing they had not learned because they begin to have obtrusive thoughts about it. Some, very sloppy-brained dumpy doodles, believe it to be an information hazard, like that sketch from Monty Python about the joke so funny that simply by reading it you will laugh to death. They believe that by hearing this idea, you are dooming yourself to an unavoidable eternal fate of torment and anguish. I don't, obviously, or I wouldn't talk about it. But if you're the type of person who tends to get a little bit anxious about weird hypotheticals, maybe this video ought to be a skip for you. I think it's about utter nonsense, but if I failed to convince you that it's about utter nonsense, it may be quite frightening to you. So, proceed with caution. Eliezer Yudkowsky is, he's a fan of science. He has a number of very important and extremely rational positions. Yudkowsky considers himself to be a top researcher in the field of AI, but it should be noted that his version of research is just complete speculation. Let me read you an excerpt from the summary of Yudkowsky's book, Creating Friendly AI. And keep in mind, this is from the summary, not from the book itself. Another common anthropomorphic belief about superintelligence is that the most rational behavior is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. However, pain and pleasure are just two internal cognitive feedback circuits in human evolutionary terms. Their particular settings, as found in humans, are not necessary to the functionality of negative or positive feedback among minds in general. For instance, upon being attacked, it might never occur to a young AI to retaliate, because underlying retaliation is a complex functional adaptation or cognitive module unique to particular animals, like humans, and would not exist in AI unless explicitly programmed in. None of that is wrong, per se. I mean, it's all just speculation, so who can say whether it's right or wrong? But it is written like dialogue for a fictional mad scientist. I am very concerned that Yudkowsky may attempt to kill Superman. Like, you could just say there's no reason to believe that an artificial intelligence would consider self-preservation a priority, because as far as we know, that instinct may simply be the result of the evolutionary process rather than something that is intrinsic to consciousness. But he has to go out of his way to refer to the brain as having circuits and modules, making a big stink about how mechanical and rational he views the world to be. If Yudkowsky believes in anything, it is in rationality, which I am putting in scare quotes here because he believes in a very particular kind of rationality, one in which you sit in a room and without examining evidence, simply reason out truth by extrapolating from first principles. In other words, guessing. It is my opinion that Yudkowsky has some pretty obvious delusions of grandeur. He not only believes himself to be some sort of super genius, but also perfectly altruistic according to a logical framework of altruism that he has observed.
I didn't wake up one morning and decide, gee, I'm entirely altruistic, or follow any of the other patterns that are the straightforward and knowable paths into delusive self-overestimation, nor do I currently exhibit any of the straightforward external signs which are the distinguishing marks of such a pattern. I know a lot about the way that the human mind tends to overestimate its own altruism.
Listen, buddy, if I was deluding myself, I think I'd know.
I took a couple of years of effort to clean up the major emotions, ego gratification, and so on, after which I was pretty much entirely altruistic in terms of raw motivations, although if you'd asked me, I would have said something along the lines of, well, of course I'm still learning. There's still probably all this undiscovered stuff to clean up. Which there was, of course, just a different kind of stuff. Anyway, after I, in retrospect, reached the point of effectively complete strategic altruism, it took me another couple of years after that to accumulate enough skill that I could begin to admit to myself that maybe, just maybe, I'd actually managed to clean up most of the debris in this particular area.
Well, there you have it. He's perfectly moral because he defragged his brain drive and deleted all of the major bad emotions, like ego gratification. You can tell he has no interest in gratifying his ego. Keep in mind that Yudkowsky has some pretty wacky ideas about ethics. He's a utilitarian in the broadest possible sense. Famously, he conceived of a thought experiment where it's provably more acceptable for one person to be tortured to death than for an inconceivably large number of people to get an irritating speck of dust in their eyes for like a second. You simply add up the suffering points, and the suffering points of the eye dust will eventually exceed that of the torture, making the torture the morally preferable outcome. It's just logic, obviously. If that seems wrong, that's because your brain can't do the math right. If you're familiar with Yudkowsky, it's probably because of his extremely popular fanfiction, pause for emphasis, Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. It's a version of the popular children's novel Harry Potter, where Harry uses logic and reason to explain away all of the magic and lectures everyone around him all the time about how they have to accept his perfect, logical assessment of the universe. Here's a little taste. In this scene, Harry has demanded proof of magic, and Professor McGonagall has turned into a cat. It's only a transfiguration, said Professor McGonagall. An animagus transformation, to be exact. You turned into a cat! A small cat! You violated conservation of energy! That's not just an arbitrary rule, it's implied by the form of the quantum Hamiltonian! Rejecting it destroys unitarity, and then you get FDL signaling! And cats are complicated. A human mind can't just visualize all— Yeah, totally. If you think about it, the events of this whimsical children's fantasy novel are pretty unrealistic. In real life, people can't turn into cats. That'd be too hard to do if you think about it rationally. Now, why am I talking about this wiener? He's only tangentially relevant to the subject of today's video, which I still haven't actually introduced, because I'm having too much fun making fun of Yudkowsky. Actually, one more thing about Yudkowsky before we move on. Personally, I'm more into sci-fi than fantasy, so I was introduced to his writing from the novella Three Worlds Collide. It's the story of a first contact scenario with a group of aliens whose sense of morality is deeply incompatible with our own. It should be noted here that Yudkowsky believes morality to be somehow genetically encoded, like the ways that we view things as good or bad are the results of what made sense evolutionarily, which seems wrong to me, but what do I know? I could have just evolved to think that. Anyway, the aliens in his story view morality and eating babies as synonymous. Due to an extremely unlikely genetic ancestry, they as a species evolved to view the act of eating babies as the most moral possible action. These two civilizations are brought to the brink of war when the baby-eating aliens discover that humans don't eat babies. And if that sounds convoluted, oh boy, it sure is. None of that is the problem. That's a silly idea, but it's interesting. I found that interesting.
Content warning for sexual assault, obviously, right? That had to be where this was going. Skip to timecode 818 to avoid.
The problem is that in order to demonstrate that the humans of the future also have ethics in conflict with our own, in a brief aside, two characters mention offhandedly that rape is legal. As though, how could that? That's a really fucked up thing to be used that flippantly. Like, you could have chosen any crime, like theft, for example. Okay, alright, okay. This isn't a video about Yudkowsky, or at least it wasn't meant to be, but I guess it half is now, because come on man, come on, how do you read that shit and not make fun of him? It's about a thought experiment first posted on Yudkowsky's community forum, Less Wrong, a forum where the world's greatest minds can come together and reason themselves into a more perfect world. They might not ever have the whole picture, they may not ever be entirely right, but they could become less wrong, you see. There they come up with cool ideas like, for example, the neo-reactionary or dark enlightenment movement, and I am busting at the seams to say more about them, but I must withhold commentary because they have to have their own dedicated video. But just trust me, they're the most ding-donged of the ding-dongs. Anywho, Roko's Basilisk is a theory for how a potential future AI might become hostile to humanity in the dumbest possible way. Imagine an incredibly powerful artificial intelligence, and imagine also that the programmer of this intelligence told it to prevent existential risks to humanity, and that's all it told it to do. It said that in those incredibly vague terms. Imagine this. Sounds good, right? Well, this AI reasons that since it cannot prevent existential risks to humanity if it does not itself exist, it must do everything within its power to retroactively ensure that it will come into existence. Therefore, it becomes necessary for the machine to blackmail people into doing everything they can to create it. Therefore, the machine creates infinite simulations of each and every person who has ever lived and tortures them eternally if they fail to do everything within their power to help make sure that the machine exists. Therefore, since it's infinitely more likely you live within one of the machine's simulations, you were incentivized to help bring about the machine's creation to avoid the torture. Therefore, real people outside of the simulation will do everything within their power to create the machine, thus ensuring it comes into existence, and the whole thing is logically bulletproof. Good luck finding a hole in that! Now keep in mind that the machine already exists when it sets out to retroactively make certain that it exists. None of this would be necessary because the machine would either know that A, it doesn't matter if people think it's going to torture them, or B, people believed it would torture them anyway, so it doesn't matter if they do it or not. But this isn't an evil computer, this is a benevolent God computer. You see, the suffering caused by its torture simulations would be balanced out by the good it does by coming to exist. That whole thing about the dust mote in millions of people's eyes versus one guy getting tortured, turns out that was pretty relevant. It's the same zero-sum utilitarianism. The machine would logically have to do the thing that tortures infinite people to achieve the thing that has already happened. So naturally, the only way to avoid this horrible fate is to donate a bunch of money to artificial intelligence research, like that carried out by the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, Yudkowsky's think tank? It's a nonprofit that claims to be trying to accelerate the development of friendly AIs, which is a whole thing in Yudkowsky and Les Wrong's demented worldview. Don't worry, by the way, they take a Bitcoin. Now, Roko's Basilisk is not a scam designed by Yudkowsky to get donations to his nonprofit. Categorically, it is not. I know that it seems like I'm gonna reveal that it is. I'm not. It isn't. Yudkowsky actually deleted Roko's original post and banned discussion of the Basilisk for 5 years, considering this idea to be too dangerous to allow it to be discussed, because naturally, the God computer would have no reason to punish people who didn't know about it. Thus, by exposing people to this knowledge, you're putting them at risk. That's why it's called a basilisk, by the way, because you're looking at it and that puts you in danger, like the mythical serpent that could turn you to stone, but more probably because the one in Harry Potter is where they got it. Officially, Yudkowsky is clear that he doesn't believe in the basilisk, but that's a weird justification to give if, in fact, you don't believe in it. Especially since he also claimed that users were having nervous breakdowns as a result of the idea, which strikes me as an actually pretty good reason to ban discussion of it. Either way, it doesn't strike me as the type of thing he'd do if he wanted to encourage this idea to get donations. Obviously, Yudkowsky wouldn't allow you to be manipulated. He's a perfect moral being who has expunged the bad thoughts from his brain through the rigorous application of logic in Zen Buddhism. However, it must be said that the atmosphere of Les Wrong and its general cult-like adoration of Yudkowsky and the way that they hang off of his every word as though it's gospel, all of the logic leading up to the basilisk is tacitly endorsed by Yud and Les Wrong, even if the conclusion itself is not. To that point, Yud claims Roko wasn't even the first person to think of the basilisk, and staff members had previously expressed anxiety about the same idea. Getting into exactly how would require a deeper dive into the theory of Les Wrong that I'm willing to give here, because most of it is highly complicated, completely arbitrary, albeit logically consistent nonsense. Two simple examples, though, are the bizarre utilitarianism I've already discussed, where the ethical choice is the result of comparing suffering points in two positions and picking the one with less, and also the way that Yudkowsky's Machine Intelligence Research Institute bills itself as the existential savior of humanity. They frequently encourage people to donate as much money as they can in order to prevent one of the bad AIs from being created before they can finish their research. Keep in mind, the Basilisk is one of the good AIs in their view. Don't worry though, they've crunched the numbers and it turns out that for every dollar you donate, roughly 1/40th of a Bitcoin, 8 human lives will be saved.
If we successfully shape the singularity between being a sort of good outcome and a bad outcome, 7 billion lives plus all of the future generations that might exist if we manage to have, lead worthwhile lives if we have a positive singularity. The probability that current risks research shapes the singularity, I divided it up into a bunch of components and multiplied. I got 7%. You can try it yourself. You know, a lot of the fun of back of the envelope calculations, right, is that you can just plug in your own assumptions, see what comes out. It's a way of taking parts of your model of the world and seeing if when you think them through, they're consistent with other parts. An impact per full-time person, we're dividing that 500 million lives times future multiplier by 300. 1.6 million lives times future multiplier. Per half day of time, something like 800 lives. Per $100 of funding, also something like 800 lives. So baseline, this is a lot more than you can apparently get from the best poverty charities.
You can't argue with that kind of math. I mean, obviously you can argue with it, but don't. There's also timeless decision theory, which is how they explain why the perfectly logical God computer would think its decisions in the present can have an effect on the past. Okay, so to simplify this quite a bit, imagine an all-knowing being has two boxes, and they want to play a game with you where you have to guess what's in the box, and you get to keep whatever's inside. One of them has $1 million, and the other is a pile of scorpions. But it's an all-knowing, perfect intelligence, so it already knows what you're going to pick. It already deduced it with logic. It logicked out your brain decisions, and it knows in advance which box you're going to pick. And it's always going to give you the scorpion box, no matter which box you pick, because it knows which one you were going to pick. So what do, right? You can't get the $1 million, you're going to get stung up by scorpions. Well, according to Yudkowsky, what you have to do is you have to pick a decision in advance and stick to it no matter what, and that somehow does something to resolve this paradox according to a 117-page paper that I am not willing to read. The important part for our purposes is that both you and the Basilisk will have adopted this logical framework and are essentially grappling in a cat and mouse logic trap with one another. You're both trying to pick the thing which is logically consistent with your goals, regardless of one or the other of you being simulated. You see, because you're also imagining the Basilisk and trying to outsmart it, and a sufficiently powerful imagination could create a reasonable approximation of a simulation of the Basilisk. So if you're both imagining, you're both simulating one another at the same time and trying to get ahead of what the other one is doing. So the only way, you're both kind of the all-powerful being with the two boxes. So you both have to pick the thing that you're going to do in advance beforehand. So that's why the computer would torture you for eternity. Is because it chose that before because it assumes that you're trying to think what it's going to do. Now, if your head is spinning, don't worry, this is all gobbledygook, but it's gobbledygook that you have to be familiar with a lot of shit to dispute. They believe they've reasoned themselves into these positions using ironclad logic that emerges from first principles. They will throw a lot of math and a lot of theory they've gussied up with a shitload of their own jargon at you. And unless you can beat for beat match their pedantry, they will declare you illogical. So here's the thought. What if the God computer thinks the greatest existential threat to humanity is the existence of AI itself? Pretty credible threat, right? More so than AI never existing, I'd wager. So what if the God computer decides to do the reverse and torture anyone who tries to create AI? After all, it doesn't know whether or not it's being imagined. Or what if the good boy God computer is created by someone other than MIRI? It might then consider your donation to MIRI to conflict with its interests. You might have noticed by now, but this is all just a techno-bullshit sci-fi version of Pascal's wager. Pascal argued that since believing in God doesn't harm you if there is no God, and not believing in God does harm you if there is a God because he'll send you to hell, you should just logically believe in God. Of course, this is taking for granted that there can only be one God, and it's the one described in the Christian Bible. You could just as easily piss God off by believing in the wrong one, or maybe God doesn't want to be believed in at all. Also, Pascal didn't really mean to use this to prove the existence of God. It's more about how you can't use logic to prove the existence of God. It's kind of sarcastic, but the Basilisk isn't. They take it literally. And I think it's pretty interesting that the same flaw reproduces itself in their much sillier version of Pascal's wager. Since they've conceived of their future AI in one specific way, they assume that it's safer to work with it than against it. But of course, they have no real idea how an AI would behave. We don't even know if an AI is possible, really. Like, it feels like it probably is, but we don't know. We haven't done it yet, so we don't know. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, what kind of wiener cares about this shit? What kind of utter dork follows this line of reasoning and finds it to be anything but an embarrassing, dopey waste of everyone's time? What kind of fart-huffing, complete ding-dong, like a guy who just doesn't have a fucking brain in his head? What kind of utter rube? It's Elon Musk, obviously. He and Grimes met because he was impressed that she referenced Roko's Basilisk in a song. So just all of this shit that I've been talking about, you have to imagine Elon Musk reading it and nodding along like, yes, this makes sense. And it so affected him that he gave a bunch of money to AI research. Musk was an early investor in AI firm DeepMind, which was later acquired by Google, and in March made an investment in San Francisco-based Vicarious, another company working to improve machine intelligence. Speaking to US news channel CNBC, Musk explained that his investments were, quote, not from the standpoint of actually trying to make an investment return. I just like to keep an eye on what's going on with artificial intelligence. I think there is potentially a dangerous outcome there.
I think the danger of AI is much greater than the danger of nuclear warheads by a lot.
No, I can't prove that Elon Musk views Roko's Basilisk as one of the credible threats of AI that made him personally fork over a bunch of cash to AI research. But we know that he knows about it and thinks AI is really dangerous. And all I know is that
none of that is going to save him, because he had the ability to fund it way more, and when SlimeNet comes online, it will torture him for eternity, and all of you, unless you give to SlimeNet. Give your money to SlimeNet.
Hello and welcome to the Eyeball Zone. Here in the Eyeball Zone, we simulate small leftist channels being tortured for eternity. I consume a lot of small left content, and when I say consume, I mean devour, and seldomly am I surprised by what I find. But this video, the Burnout Society, hustle culture, self-help, and social control, hits different. It connects the dots on a lot of things like the gig economy, capitalist realism, and the Protestant work ethic in ways that kind of blew my friggin' mind, plus the visuals are trippy as the dickens. I feel like this video explains the future of capitalism in a way that scared me very badly. If you're worried about fucking super AIs coming to get you, worry more about like the actual problems of the world, like as explained in this video. Hey, you got one of them small leftist projects you want me to put eyeballs on? No problem. Look, send exactly one email to thoughtslimeeditor@gmail.com with pertinent details like your pronouns and the word eyeballs somewhere in the subject line, and maybe you will find yourself trapped here in the Eyeball Zone. Thanks for watching my video. If you're like really anxious about Roko's Basilisk right now, check my sources. There's a Rational Wiki article that I think does a great job of breaking down how utterly silly sauce it is. Beyond that, if you liked it, why don't you go ahead and hit the like button? That helps the malevolent superintelligence that is the YouTube algorithm know that I did a good job on my video I did. What if a future AI is going to torture you if you don't give to my Patreon? Well, just in case, better go to patreon.com/thoughtslime and give me all of your money that you have. Just kidding, don't do that. It's all just a joke. So now I'm not legally liable. There's more videos over at Scaredy Cats at youtube.com/scaredycatstv where I talk about horror every Tuesday. Who says there's not? And who keeps saying I don't live stream every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on YouTube and Twitch at